The sister who was never a sister. I found the marriage certificate on a Tuesday morning, tucked between folded dish towels in the kitchen drawer where Nadia kept her important papers. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a rubber band. And in the space of 30 seconds, every single thing I believed about my life, my marriage, my home, my future, turned into something I didn't have a word for yet. The certificate had my husband's name on it, Daniel Roy Calloway, and next to it, in neat black ink, was not my name. It was hers, Nadia Calloway, his sister, except she wasn't his sister, not even close. Let me take you back to the beginning, because if I start here, with me standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile holding a piece of paper that dismantled 3 years of my life, you'll have questions. So many questions. I had them too. I had all of them, all at once, and they hit me like a wall of water, the kind that takes your legs out from under you before you even realize you've fallen. So let me start at the beginning. Let me tell you about the first time I saw Daniel Calloway, about the way I thought I'd finally found something real, and about how the most elaborate deception I've ever witnessed was already fully in motion before I even knew his last name. I was 28 when I met Daniel. I was working as a graphic designer for a mid-sized marketing firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. My life was steady, predictable, comfortable in the way that people describe as fine when they mean a little empty. I had a nice apartment with a bay window, a cat named Croissant, a good group of friends, and a dating history that could charitably be described as inconsistent. I'd had 2 serious relationships, one in college that ended when he transferred schools, and we both decided the distance wasn't worth it, and one at 25 that lasted almost 2 years before he told me he wasn't in a place to be someone's person. Whatever that meant. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't desperate. But I was, somewhere underneath all the contentment I performed for myself, very quietly, lonely. Daniel walked into that loneliness like he knew exactly where the door was. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party in March. His name was Marcus, the mutual friend, and he'd just bought a condo near Uptown and wanted to show it off with a Saturday party that started at noon and went until someone's neighbor called about the music at 11. I almost didn't go. I'd had a long week. I was tired. Croissant had knocked a full glass of red wine onto my white blouse that morning, and I was genuinely considering spending the entire weekend in pajamas watching cooking shows. But my friend Simone talked me into it. She always talked me into things. Daniel was standing by the kitchen island when I first saw him. He was tall, not absurdly so, but tall enough that I noticed it, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the temples and these light gray eyes that I would later describe to Simone as the color of a lake right before it rains. He was wearing a navy Henley and jeans and talking to someone I didn't know, and he was laughing at something, and even across the room I thought, there is nothing performed about that laugh. It reached his eyes. It changed his whole face. Marcus introduced us about an hour later. Daniel shook my hand, actually shook it, which I found both old-fashioned and endearing, and said, "Marcus talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." He said it without any of the usual layer of flirtation that makes that kind of line feel slick and rehearsed. He just said it like it was true, because apparently it was. We talked for 4 hours at that party. We ended up sitting on Marcus's back patio with paper plates of food going cold in our laps, talking about everything and nothing. Our jobs, our families, a road trip he'd taken through New Mexico when he was 22, a photography class I'd taken once and given up and always regretted quitting. At some point, Marcus came out to check on us and laughed and went back inside and left us alone, which I think tells you everything you need to know about how that night felt. He texted me the next morning. Not a hey text, a real text. I looked up that photographer we were talking about, Saul Leiter. You were right. His use of color is extraordinary. Also, I'm thinking about that New Mexico trip and wondering if I've been describing the landscape wrong. It wasn't red, it was more like rust. Rust and gold. I don't know why that feels important to get right. I read that text 3 times before I responded. We were together within 2 weeks. Officially, exclusively, completely. I know that sounds fast, but it didn't feel fast. It felt like something slipping into place. The specific, satisfying click of a mechanism that's been waiting to engage. We spent our weekends together almost immediately. We cooked dinner, we wandered through farmers markets, we drove out to Crowder's Mountain and hiked on a Sunday in April while the dogwoods were still blooming. And he took a photo of me standing on a ridge with my hair blowing across my face, and he looked at it and said, "That's what happy looks like." And I kissed him right there on the trail, and I thought, yes, this is what I was waiting for. He had his own place at the time, a rented house on a quiet street in the South End, a neat, minimalist space that somehow felt lived in and warm. He told me he'd moved to Charlotte 18 months earlier from Richmond, Virginia, where he'd grown up. He worked as a structural engineer for a civil infrastructure company, traveled occasionally for site visits, made a good living. He was close with his family, he said, but not in an overwhelming way. He had a younger sister, Nadia, who he mentioned occasionally, affectionately, the way you mention someone who is simply a constant part of your landscape without requiring much explanation. "She's a character," he said once, with a sideways smile that I interpreted as brotherly fondness. "Very opinionated, very particular. She's been staying with a friend in Atlanta for a while, but she'll probably end up back near me eventually. She usually does." I remember thinking, that's sweet. He looks out for her. I liked that about him. I liked everything about him. I should say here, because it matters, that I am not an unsuspecting person by nature. I'm not naive. I have a good eye for details. I notice when things don't add up. I am the kind of person who, when watching a movie with friends, usually figures out the twist before the halfway point and has to physically prevent myself from saying it out loud. I tell you this not to excuse what I missed, but to explain why what Daniel built was so extraordinarily, painstakingly thorough. Because here's the thing about a deception designed specifically to fool a smart, attentive person: it has to be seamless. And this one was. For 18 months, it was absolutely seamless. We dated for a year before he proposed. He did it simply and privately. Not a restaurant, not a crowded place, not a performance. He did it on a Sunday afternoon in my apartment, sitting on the floor with croissant in his lap and rain against the windows, and he pulled out a ring that had been his grandmother's and said, "I have been trying to figure out how to say this correctly for about 6 months, and I've decided there is no correct way. So, will you be my family? Officially?" And I said yes, before he finished the sentence. We got married in October of the following year, at a small venue outside of Asheville. Stone walls, candle-filled lanterns, the mountains going amber and rust behind us, which felt fitting. 60 people. Simone was my maid of honor. Daniel's best man was a college friend named Patrick, who gave a speech that made everyone cry. There was no family from Daniel's side at the wedding beyond one older cousin and an uncle he was fond of. His parents were both deceased. His mother had passed when he was in his mid-20s, his father a few years before we met. It was, he told me, the reason he valued building his own family so deliberately. Nadia wasn't at the wedding. He told me she was living abroad at the time, somewhere in Portugal, working remotely and traveling. He said he'd told her she was missed, but she sent her love and a beautiful handwritten card, which he showed me. The handwriting was looping and feminine. "She's the wandering type," he said. "You'll meet her eventually." I thought about that later. How carefully crafted that was. how eventually was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. We bought a house together in February of the following year, a 4-bedroom colonial in a neighborhood called Haversford, on the western edge of Charlotte, with a front porch and a magnolia tree in the backyard, and a big open kitchen with slate gray tile floors. It was more house than 2 people needed, I said. Daniel said he was thinking ahead. He wanted space. He wanted us to have room to grow. And besides, he said, walking through the empty rooms the first time we saw it, I like the idea of people being able to come here. Family, friends. I want this to be the kind of house people want to come to. I thought that was beautiful. God, I thought everything he said was beautiful. We moved in that spring, and 3 months later Nadia arrived. I remember the weekend she came. It was a Saturday in July, hot and thick-aired, the kind of Charlotte summer that turns the world into a slow, heavy thing. Daniel told me on a Wednesday that Nadia had come back from Europe, that she was having a rough transition, that she needed a place to land while she figured out her next steps. Just for a few months, he said, with an expression that was both apologetic and certain. She's family. I can't say no. Of course, I said. Because what else would I say? She was his sister. I had never met her. I had 3 years of warmth built up about her from his stories, and I had 4 bedrooms. Of course she can stay. She drove up on Saturday morning in a silver hatchback stuffed with boxes and bags and a large potted snake plant that she carried in first before anything else, cradling it against her chest. She was, and this is the word that immediately occurred to me, striking. Not pretty in a soft, approachable way, but striking. Sharp jaw, dark hair cut blunt at the collarbone, dark eyes with a way of looking at you that made you feel slightly examined. She was a few years younger than Daniel, early 30s, lean and precise in her movements. She shook my hand in the driveway and said, "I've heard so much about you, Kara. Daniel's told me everything." She was smiling, but the smile had an odd quality that I couldn't immediately name. It was like a smile that knew something. I told myself I was imagining things. Daniel carried boxes. Nadia and I stood in the kitchen and I made iced tea, and she sat at the counter and told me about Portugal. Lisbon mostly, a little time in the Algarve. And she was interesting to talk to. Funny even, in a dry, unexpected way. She made a joke about Portuguese bureaucracy that made me laugh genuinely. I remember thinking, okay. I was nervous for nothing. She's great. This is going to be fine. And for a while, for the first few weeks, it was fine. She settled into the guest room at the end of the hall, the one with the window seat that looked out over the magnolia tree. She kept her space tidy. She was quiet in the mornings, made her own coffee, didn't intrude on our rhythm. She'd gotten some kind of remote work. Consulting, she said vaguely, and she spent most of the day at the desk in her room or occasionally at the kitchen table with her laptop. She made dinner sometimes, and she was an extraordinary cook, which I said aloud once, and she thanked me with that same odd smile. She and Daniel watched TV together sometimes in the evenings, old shows they'd apparently grown up watching, and there was an ease between them that I found both touching and, in some low-frequency way, I couldn't justify, slightly excluding. But I was being paranoid. She was his sister. Of course, they were easy with each other. I kept telling myself that. I kept telling myself that for 7 months. The first crack appeared in October. Not a big crack, just a hairline fracture. The kind of thing you'd paint over without thinking. I had come home from work early on a Thursday afternoon, headache, light sensitive, the kind that starts behind one eye and eventually takes over your whole skull. And the house was quiet. Daniel was supposed to be at a site visit in Greensboro. Nadia's car was in the driveway. I came in through the side door and walked down the hall and heard voices from behind the closed door of her room. 2 voices, hers and Daniel's. I stopped. I wasn't eavesdropping exactly. I was just stopped. Something stopped me. I heard Nadia say, "You need to be more careful." Her voice was low and taut, the way people sound when they're controlling something. I heard Daniel say, "Quieter," so I only caught the shape of it. "I know, I know. I'm handling it." "You've been saying that for 6 months," she said. And then there was a silence, and I made myself move. I made myself walk down the hall with deliberate, audible footsteps, the way you do when you want someone to know you're coming. By the time I knocked on the door and pushed it open, they were sitting on opposite sides of the room, Nadia at her desk, Daniel standing near the window, and both of them turned to look at me with expressions that were just a half second late in rearranging themselves into normal. "Hey," Daniel said. "Didn't expect you home early." "Headache," I said. I looked between them. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Nadia said. "I was just telling Daniel about a problem with a client." "Right," Daniel said, and he crossed the room and kissed my temple and said, "Go lie down. I'll check on you in a bit." And he was so smooth about it, so warm, so immediate, that I took the headache to the bedroom and lay down and told myself I'd heard a snippet of a work conversation and my imagination had done the rest. But the crack was there, and I started to notice other things, small things, first. I'm the kind of person who notices small things. I noticed that Nadia seemed to know about events in our life that I hadn't mentioned to her. She knew about the anniversary dinner Daniel and I had in September. The restaurant, the wine, some detail I was sure I hadn't shared. And when I mentioned it, she said, "Oh, Daniel mentioned it," so casually that I almost let it go. I almost let it go every time. I noticed that she had a way of touching things in the kitchen, rearranging the dish towel, repositioning the fruit bowl, that was proprietary in a way I struggled to articulate. Small, territorial adjustments, the kind you make in spaces you think of as yours. I noticed that when Daniel got home from work, he went to find her before he came to find me. Not every day. Maybe 3 days out of 5. A detour to the kitchen where she usually was, a few words exchanged, something easy and habitual. And then he'd come find me. I told myself I was being petty. I was jealous of his relationship with his own sister. I was being exactly the kind of insecure person I'd always promised myself I wouldn't become. I went to the gym more. I threw myself into a new project at work. I had dinner with Simone twice a month and laughed and drank wine and felt like myself again. I was managing it. I was fine. Everything was fine. The second crack came in December, and it wasn't small. It was a Friday night. Daniel was out, client dinner, he'd said, and sent me a text at 8 saying it was running long. I was in bed by 10, reading. Nadia's light was still on under her door when I passed on the way to the bathroom at midnight. I didn't think anything of it. But then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Just a link. No message? I almost deleted it. I thought it was spam, but something made me click it. It was a photograph. Daniel and Nadia. In a restaurant I didn't recognize, sitting across a small table from each other, leaning toward each other, and he was holding her hand across the table. Not a sibling handhold. His thumb was moving on her knuckles. His face was... I am going to be precise here, because I need you to understand what I saw. His face was the face of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and stared at my phone for what felt like a long time. Then I went to bed. And I didn't sleep. Not a single minute. I kept rationalizing. Siblings are physically affectionate. It was a weird angle. I was catastrophizing. But the image was there behind my eyes all night. And the thing about an image like that is that it doesn't argue with you. It doesn't explain itself. It just sits there, patient and permanent, waiting for you to catch up with what it's telling you. It was 6 more weeks before I found the marriage certificate. 6 weeks during which I watched differently. I watched everything differently. I stopped performing, not noticing, and started actually looking. And what I saw, once I allowed myself to really see it, was everywhere. The way she finished his sentences, the way he stood differently in rooms she occupied. A credit card statement I found in his jacket pocket. I was taking his jacket to the dry cleaner. I wasn't looking through his things. That listed a hotel in Nashville for a weekend he'd told me was a work conference. A single hotel room for 2 nights. The way her bathroom had things in it that a woman uses in front of a man she's comfortable with. Not just a visiting sister's toiletries, but the specific arrangement of someone who shares a bathroom without thinking about it. I found a photo in his desk drawer of the two of them, recent from the look of it, standing somewhere I didn't recognize, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, their bodies fitted together with a familiarity that had nothing to do with growing up in the same house. And then I found the marriage certificate. Tuesday morning, dish towel drawer, rubber band, Nadia Vasilenko. Vasilenko. Her maiden name, not Calloway. That was interesting, wasn't it? Married to Daniel Roy Calloway. Date, April 14th, 3 years before he and I met at Marcus's housewarming party. Filed in Richmond, Virginia. Not his sister, his wife. His wife of 6 years when I married him. His wife of 9 years now. I put the certificate back exactly where I found it. I closed the drawer. I stood very still for a moment, and I heard the birds outside. Someone told me once that a cardinal in your yard means someone who loves you is near. And I thought about the specific, terrible patience of the trap I had walked into. How much planning it had required. How long they had both looked at me and known something I didn't know. How many of my tender moments, my joy, my trust, my love, had been witnessed by two people who were privately, secretly, permanently entangled in a deception so complete it had its own architecture. I didn't cry. I stood at the kitchen counter, and I didn't cry. I made a cup of coffee and I drank it, and I thought very clearly about what I was going to do next. I called in sick to work, and then I called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Osei. Pat, she said. Everyone called her Pat. And she had an office in a glass building on Tryon Street, and a reputation that my colleague Denny had mentioned once in the context of his own divorce. She's the one you want if you want the other person to genuinely regret what they did. She saw me that afternoon at 4 o'clock. I drove downtown in the October cold. It was late October by then, just past the anniversary of our wedding, which sat in me like a stone. And I sat across from her desk and I said, "My husband has a legal wife. I was told she was his sister. I've been living with both of them in my house for 7 months." Patricia Osei looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. I told her about Daniel, the Henley at the party, the text about Saul Leiter, the ring from his grandmother, the wedding in the mountains with the candle lanterns, and I told her about Nadia arriving with her snake plant and her too-knowing smile, and I told her about 7 months of watching something I couldn't name until a Tuesday morning when a rubber band changed my life. I talked for almost 2 hours. Pat took notes. She asked precise, practical questions, and I answered them. By the end of it, I felt scraped out in a specific way. Not devastated, not yet, but emptied. Like I'd been carrying something extremely heavy for a very long time and had only just been allowed to set it down. "Okay," Pat said. "Here's where you are legally." She turned her notepad around so I could see her notes. "In North Carolina, bigamy is both a criminal offense and grounds for annulment. Your marriage to Daniel Calloway is legally void. Not voidable. Void. It never existed in the eyes of the law because he was already legally married. You have grounds to file for annulment, and you have grounds to pursue him for fraud and misrepresentation. You may also have claims regarding marital assets, specifically the house. The house is in both our names, I said. Yes, Pat said, which means half of it is yours by right. And given that you entered this arrangement under fraudulent circumstances, I believe we can make a compelling case for substantially more than half. I thought about the magnolia tree in the backyard. What about her? I said. Nadia, what about her part in this? Pat folded her hands on the desk. She committed fraud alongside him. She participated in the deception. She may have civil liability. She also, depending on what we find, may have been complicit in inducing you to purchase the house, which adds another dimension. She paused. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think about your answer. What is it that you want, ultimately? Do you want legal remedies? The annulment? The financial claims? Potentially criminal charges? Do you want them to suffer publicly? Or do you want some combination? I thought about it. I thought about Daniel's face in that photograph. I thought about the certificate in the drawer with Nadia's maiden name on it, and the date 3 years before he'd ever made me feel like something real was beginning. I want everything, I said. I want every legal remedy. I want the house. I want the humiliation to be public enough that they cannot simply walk away and build the next version of this somewhere else. And I want to make sure this never happens to another woman. Pat smiled for the first time. It was a very specific smile. Not warm exactly, but satisfied. The smile of someone who has been waiting to hear exactly that sentence. Good, she said. Then here's what we're going to do. And here's the most important thing. You cannot let them know you know. Not yet. Can you do that? I thought about going home to that house, about sitting at dinner with Daniel and Nadia and cutting my chicken and asking about their days, about lying next to Daniel in our bed, our fraudulent, legally meaningless bed, and keeping my face completely neutral. Yes, I said, I can do that. And I did. For 3 weeks, I did exactly that. And those 3 weeks were the most exhausting and clarifying of my life. Because when you stop hoping that something isn't true and start working against it instead, the grief that would normally overwhelm you gets redirected into something purposeful. I wasn't sleeping well, but I was thinking clearly. I was watching clearly. And what I observed, now that I had permission to see it fully, was detailed and damning and almost impressive in its audacity. I started documenting. Pat had told me to document everything, and I did. I had a small notebook in my work bag that I wrote in every day. Observations, dates, overheard conversations, anomalies. I photographed things subtly. The photo I found in his desk drawer, another hotel receipt that turned up in the pocket of a jacket he'd left on the coat rack, a birthday card she'd written him that was in the recycling bin half crumpled. I smoothed it out, photographed it, returned it. The card said, "For 16 years, I have been more certain of you than anything. That has not changed. It will not change. Whatever else is happening, and I know it's harder than you're letting on, I am still here. I am still yours. Always. N. 16 years. I did the math. They had been together since they were in their early 20s. Whatever story he had told me about his past, his aloneness, his family losses, the way he moved through the world like a man who had been self-sufficient for a long time, was built on 16 years of a real relationship with a real woman who was present in my house, drinking my coffee, rearranging my dish towels, and watching me with that smile that knew something. I took a photo of the birthday card and sent it to Pat. She called me that evening. "This is excellent," she said. "This establishes the ongoing nature of the relationship. Combined with the hotel records and the marriage certificate, we have everything we need. I want you to come in at the end of this week so we can finalize the strategy and I can tell you exactly what's going to happen and when." I sat in my car in the driveway to take that call, in the dark, watching the light in the front window. Nadia's silhouette moved through the kitchen. She paused at the window, looking out. At what? I don't know. And then moved on. I watched her, and I felt something crystallize in me that I hadn't expected to feel. Not hatred exactly, not even anger in the burning, uncontrolled sense. Something colder, something that knew exactly where it was going. Pat's strategy was thorough. I will say that for her. She had been building cases like this for 20 years, and she approached the whole thing with the kind of quiet, methodical precision that made me feel, for the first time since the dish towel drawer, that I was not helpless, that I was not a victim waiting to be finished off, that I was a woman in possession of a tremendous amount of power that hadn't been activated yet. Here was the plan. Pat had filed the annulment petition but was holding it, not served yet. She'd also filed a civil fraud complaint and had contacted privately and carefully a journalist she knew at the Charlotte Observer who covered exactly this kind of story. Not scandal for its own sake, but what she called institutional deception. The kind of story that named names and had documented evidence and served a genuine public purpose. In addition, Pat had reached out to the NC State Bar, not because Daniel was a lawyer, but because his company held certain contracts with state infrastructure projects. And fraud of this nature, if it involved financial misrepresentation in the context of a shared property purchase, had reporting implications. There were also Daniel's professional references and clients to think about. He had, on his LinkedIn profile and on his company bio, a section about personal integrity that Pat found particularly useful for purposes of what she delicately called reputational context. But before any of that, before the legal machinery moved, before the journalist made any calls, before any of the public components activated, Pat said I needed to have the confrontation. Not because it was emotionally necessary, though it was, but because of what it would produce. "People reveal themselves when they're caught," she said. "They say things, damaging things. I want you to record the conversation." "North Carolina is a one-party consent state," I said. I'd looked it up. "Exactly," Pat said. "You can record any conversation you're part of without the other party's knowledge. I want you to have both of them in the room. I want you to have your phone recording. And I want you to say exactly what I'm about to tell you to say." She walked me through it. I practiced it alone in my car on the way home. I practiced it in the shower. I knew my lines. I knew my cues. I knew what I was doing and why, and the knowing of it was the thing that held me together through 3 more dinners with them, 3 more evenings of listening to Nadia's dry humor and watching Daniel refill my wine with a solicitousness that now read as guilt rather than affection. 3 more mornings of waking up next to a man I had loved with everything I had, and recognizing that the love was real and the man was not. At least, not the man I'd loved. That man had never existed. He was a role Daniel had played with extraordinary skill, and somewhere underneath it was the real Daniel, the one who came home to a woman he called his sister, the one who kept a marriage certificate in a dish towel drawer, the one who had 16 years of history with someone else and had somehow decided that what he needed, for reasons I can only theorize about, was to also have me. I did wonder during those final weeks about why. Why had he done it? Was it money? The house was mostly my down payment. I'd had savings, An inheritance from my grandmother. I'd contributed 60% of the purchase price. Was I a financial strategy? A front? Or was it more human than that? Was it a midlife rupture? A desire for something new? A fantasy of a second, different life that he tried to make real by maintaining two women in the same house and hoping neither of us would look in the right drawer? I didn't know. I still don't know everything. But I knew enough. I chose a Sunday. Sunday evenings in that house were always the same. Daniel cooked, Nadia set the table, I usually made a salad, and the three of us sat down together in the dining room with the old pine table that we'd found at an estate sale in Waxhaw. It was, ironically, one of the rhythms of our household that I had genuinely loved. I had genuinely loved sitting at that table. I had looked at those Sunday dinners as evidence of family, of belonging, of the home I was building. I started the recording on my phone in my cardigan pocket before I came downstairs. I had eaten almost nothing that day, not because I was anxious, but because I was running on something else entirely, some cleaner fuel than food. I was calm in a way that surprised me. I was ready. We sat down. Daniel served the pasta. He made a good Sunday pasta, an aglio e olio he'd been making since before I knew him, probably since before I mattered to this story at all. Nadia poured the wine. I looked at the two of them, at the table they'd set between them, at the domestic architecture of the lie I'd been living inside, and I took a breath. I need to ask you both something, I said. They both looked at me. Daniel with mild curiosity, Nadia with something that flickered, just for a second, before it settled back into blankness. I found the marriage certificate, I said. I kept my voice very steady, very even. The one in the kitchen drawer, with both your names on it, Daniel Roy Calloway and Nadia Vasilenko, married in Richmond, Virginia, April 14th. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that has a physical weight. I watched Daniel's face go through several things in very rapid succession. Shock, calculation, something that might have been relief, actually, like a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time, before he said, Kara. Just my name, like it was a paragraph. Don't, I said. I need you both to understand something before anyone says anything else. I have a recording. I have documentation. I have an attorney. I have a journalist. Everything you say in the next few minutes matters significantly, so I need you to be precise. Nadia set down her wine glass. She looked at Daniel, a long, specific look, the look of two people who have an entire language built of silences, and she was speaking it right now, and I could read it. She was asking him how much I knew. She was asking him what to do. And he, for the first time in 3 years, had nothing. His face said nothing. How long have you been her husband? I asked him directly. Your real wife, I mean, not whatever you called me. Kara, please, he started. Answer the question. He ran a hand through his hair. We got married in... You have the date. You know the date. So for 6 years before you came to that party at Marcus's place, you were already married to her. It's not... He stopped. He tried again. Nadia and I have a complicated history. What you and I have is real. What I feel for you is... Stop, I said. And I was surprised by how little I had to work to sound composed. The composure was genuine. I don't need you to explain your feelings. I need you to understand the situation you're in. Your marriage to me is legally void. You committed bigamy, which is a criminal offense in this state. You induced me to purchase a home under fraudulent circumstances. You, Nadia. You participated in every aspect of this deception. You moved into my home and allowed me to believe you were my sister-in-law while knowing you were his wife. Nadia spoke for the first time. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it, flattened, careful. I understand how this looks, she said. I know you do, I said. And I want you to think very carefully about what comes next, because what comes next has been in motion for 3 weeks. I've been building the case for 3 weeks. I looked at her directly. The journalist is particularly interested, I think, in the human element. 2 people deceiving one woman for multiple years. The domestic situation of it. The specific cruelty of inviting the woman you deceived into the same house and watching her try to make you welcome. Something moved across Nadia's face then. For just a moment. The briefest possible crack in her composure. I thought I saw something that wasn't calculation. Something that might have been shame. It came and went so fast. I couldn't be sure. Daniel stood up. He said my name again, Kara, and started walking around the table toward me, with his hands out in that open, appealing gesture, and I stood up too and said, "Don't come near me," and the firmness in my voice stopped him 6 feet away. "What do you want?" he said. It wasn't defensive, it was exhausted. He asked it like a man who'd known this moment was coming and had been dreading it and was now just grateful it had arrived. "Tell me what you want." "I want the house," I said. "I'm buying your share. My attorney has had it appraised and has prepared the paperwork. You'll accept the buyout at the assessed value minus the legal fees I've incurred, minus the cost of 3 weeks of evidence collection. You will sign, and you will be out of this house within 30 days. I looked at Nadia. "Both of you." "And the journalist?" Nadia said. "That depends on you," I said. I sat back down calmly and picked up my fork. "Fully cooperative, signed paperwork by Friday, no contest on any of the legal filings. And I tell the journalist I've decided not to participate in the story. Partial cooperation, delays, any attempt to contest or complicate, and I hand over everything. The certificate, the hotel receipts, the birthday card, the photograph from that restaurant, every document, the full story." "You kept the birthday card," Nadia said. Not quite a question. "I kept everything," I said. There was a long pause. Daniel sat down slowly, like something was coming out of him. Not out of his posture exactly, but from deeper, from the place where the performance had been maintained for so long. He looked at Nadia. She was looking at the table. There was something between them in that moment that was private and painful in a way I hadn't expected. Something that reminded me that whatever they were, however they'd behaved, they were also 2 people who'd been together for 16 years, and something in their story was collapsing too. I didn't let it soften me. But I noticed it. I am that honest. "I need you to understand something," Daniel said. His voice had changed. Something more real in it, I thought, though I was no longer a reliable judge of what was real from him. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I said. "That's the saddest part. I believe you. I believe you didn't want to hurt me. And you did it anyway, methodically, for years. That's the part you're going to have to live with." I took a bite of pasta. "This is good, by the way," I said. The pasta. And I meant it. I genuinely did. I sat at my table in my house and I ate the pasta and I waited for them to decide what to do. They signed on Friday. Both of them. Pat called me that afternoon to confirm. "Every document," she said. "Clean. No contest. No complications." She paused. "I've been doing this for 20 years, Kara. I want you to know The way you handled this room is not something most people can do. You were extraordinary. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a coffee shop on South Boulevard when she called. The afternoon light was coming through the windshield, the long amber light of late October in the Carolinas, and I sat in it and felt not triumph exactly, something quieter, something that had to do with having been through something terrible and finding yourself on the other side of it, entirely intact. More intact, maybe, than before, more clearly yourself. Daniel moved out the following week. I came home from work on a Tuesday and his things were gone. His clothes, his books, his coffee equipment, the print we'd bought together at a gallery in Asheville. He'd left, on the kitchen counter, a single handwritten note. It said, "I'm sorry, Kara. That doesn't fix anything. I know that. But it's true." I read it once. I put it in the recycling bin. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the quiet of the house that was entirely mine now, and I listened to it. Just listened to the quiet. It sounded different than it used to. Emptier in some ways, and in other ways, fuller. Nadia left 2 days before he did. She packed up her room, her books, her desk lamp, her snake plant, and she brought the plant down to the front hall and paused at the kitchen doorway where I was standing with a mug of tea. We looked at each other. Two women who had shared a house for 7 months and had never shared the truth. She said, "I want to say something." "Okay," I said. "I told myself for a long time that you were just a phase." She said it without her usual flatness, with something raw in it. I told myself he'd end it eventually and it wouldn't matter. I was wrong about that. Not because he didn't end it. Obviously it ended. But because you were a real person, and I helped him treat you like you weren't. She stopped. "I don't expect you to forgive that." "I won't," I said, gently but clearly. "I don't think I need to." She nodded. She picked up the snake plant and carried it out the front door. I watched from the porch as she loaded it into her car. She didn't look back when she drove away. I stood on my porch and watched her taillights until they turned the corner and disappeared. And then I went back inside. The journalist's story ran anyway. Not because I handed over documents, but because he found his own sources. A woman in Richmond who'd known Daniel and Nadia for years. A former colleague who'd heard things. It ran as a smaller piece than it might have been. Not front page, but substantial. My name wasn't in it. I'd asked for that as a condition of my limited cooperation, and Pat had negotiated it successfully. The story was about bigamy patterns and the legal loopholes that allowed them to persist, and the women who were rarely identified because the shame got displaced onto them even when they were the wronged party. It was a good piece. I read it 3 times. I kept the house. I painted the dining room. I'd always wanted to, and Daniel had always had a reason to delay. I painted it a deep, warm terracotta that catches the light in the late afternoon and makes the whole room feel like a different place. I put new curtains in the bedroom. I moved the furniture in the living room until it felt like mine, arranged to my preferences and not to the compromise of 2 people. Simone came over for dinner 3 weeks after Daniel left. She brought wine and a very good cheese board, and the particular kind of energy she has when she is both furious on your behalf and trying to be whatever you need, rather than what her fury needs. We sat at the pine table, the old estate sale table that I kept because I actually loved it, and it was mine and it held dinners that were real regardless of what surrounded them. And she poured the wine and looked at me very carefully and said, "How are you?" And I mean, actually. I'm okay," I said. And I meant it in the way I meant it. Not fine, not healed, not over it, but okay. Standing up, intact. I spent a year and a half thinking I was paranoid, gaslit, basically, and finding out that the thing I was afraid of was real. That's devastating in one way, but it's also clarifying. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't insecure. I was reading something real that I just didn't have all the words for yet. You need to write this down, Simone said. Everything. For yourself, not for anyone else. I already have, I said. And I poured my wine and I looked at the terracotta walls and the new curtains and the magnolia tree going bare outside the window, its last October leaves coming down in the early dark. And I thought about what it means to build a home, what it actually means, not the brick and the tile and the 4 bedrooms, but the thing underneath, the trust you pour into it, the future you imagine in it, the specific tenderness of making a place in the world and calling it yours. I had all of that. He hadn't taken it. Neither of them had taken it, because it wasn't in the house, it was in me. It had always been in me. I started therapy in November with a woman named Dr. Farah Hollis, who had an office in a converted Victorian on the east side with tall bookshelves and a sound machine in the hall and a way of asking questions that felt like she was handing you a small lamp and saying, "Go ahead, look around in there. I'll be right here." In the first session, I told her the outline of what had happened, and she listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What's surprising you most right now? Not about what happened, about yourself as you move through it." I thought about it. "How much I don't miss him," I said. "I thought I would be destroyed. I thought I would fall apart. I thought the loss would be the biggest thing. But I don't miss him. I miss the version of him I thought existed. I grieve that person, that relationship, that future. But the actual Daniel Calloway, the real one, I don't miss at all, because I never really knew him." She nodded slowly. "That's very important," she said. "What you fell in love with was partly your own capacity for love, your own imagination. The relationship was built on something real. It was built on your realness." I sat with that for a long time. In the spring, the following April, 6 months after the confrontation, 7 months after I found the certificate, I started a small project that Simone had been encouraging for a while. I took an online course in photography. Still photography, the kind I'd always been drawn to. I bought a secondhand film camera on eBay, a Minolta from 1982 that still worked beautifully, and I started shooting things slowly and deliberately. The magnolia in the backyard coming back into bloom, croissant on the window seat in the late afternoon light, the terracotta dining room wall when the sun hit it at 5 o'clock and turned it something richer than itself. I developed the first roll at a lab near UNCC, and when I held the prints, I felt something shift in me. Something like, yes, this is mine. I've told you this story in the order I lived it, which is to say, I've told it the way it felt, not the way it looked from outside. From outside, it probably looked like a woman who got deceived and then got justice and then rebuilt her life, neat and sequential. But from inside, it was more layered than that. It was grief and fury and shame. The particular shame of having been fooled, of having made Nadia tea and laughed at her jokes and felt grateful for her presence. And it was also, underneath all of it, this stubborn, persistent refusal to become smaller, to be the cautionary tale, to be the woman who trusted too much and learned not to trust again. I learned something different than not trusting. I learned to trust myself. I learned to trust the small voice that said, "That conversation had an odd quality. That photo means something, that smile knows something." I had always had that voice. I had spent 3 years overriding it because I wanted the story to be what it seemed to be, because the story of Daniel and Kara was so beautiful that questioning it felt like vandalism. But the voice was right. It was always right. And now I listen to it. I also learned, and this is the part that I think about most, that deception requires the deceived person's cooperation, not their consent, not their willingness, but their cooperation in the sense that we are all, every day, working on the assumption that the people we love are showing us their real faces. We extend that assumption because without it, the world becomes unlivable. And people like Daniel use that essential human generosity as a tool. They step into the warmth you're extending and they use it, and the using of it is the betrayal. Not just of the specific trust, but of something more fundamental. The criminal complaint for bigamy was filed in October, a year after the confrontation. The process in North Carolina is slow and the outcome uncertain, but Pat says the documentation is solid. There will be a hearing. Daniel and Nadia have an attorney now, the same attorney, which Pat found both predictable and useful. Shared counsel is always a mistake in cases like this, she told me. Their interests are not identical, and at some point that's going to create friction. I believe her. I don't spend much time thinking about them. This is not performance or bravado. I genuinely don't. I have my house and my work and my camera and Croissant and Simone and Dr. Hollis and the magnolia tree, which bloomed extraordinarily this spring, white flowers the size of a hand against a blue sky on a Thursday morning, when I came out onto the back porch with my coffee and just stood in it for a while. The beauty of it felt earned in a way that pre-Nadia beauty hadn't. Or maybe I'm more present in moments now. Maybe the cost of what I went through is that I am more willing to stand on a porch and look at a flowering tree and let it be exactly what it is, no story around it, no interpretation, just the white petals and the sky and the coffee going warm in my hands. I met someone in March. I want to say that carefully, because it's not the point of this story, and it's not where the resolution lives. The resolution doesn't live in another man. It lives in the fact that I'm standing, that I'm whole. But I met someone. His name is Owen. He's a landscape architect. He's funny in the specific way I like, which is dry and a little strange, and on our third date, I told him the outline of what had happened. Not everything, not yet, but enough. I watched his face, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you for telling me that. And I want to say, before you ask yourself whether you should have said it, thank you. That was brave, and I don't take it lightly." And I thought, yes, that's how people respond. That's what real looks like. I don't know where that's going. I don't need to know yet. I know what I'm not willing to accept, and I know what I am, and I know that the woman who stood at a kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning with a marriage certificate in her hands and chose not to fall apart, chose instead to be methodical and clear-eyed and purposeful. That woman is the woman I've been becoming for my whole life. The betrayal accelerated it. The betrayal didn't make me. I was already here. But I am, now, much more clearly, entirely myself. The snake plant is still in Nadia's old room. She forgot it, or left it. I'm not sure which. I thought about throwing it out. I thought about it for a long time. And then I decided to keep it because it's a healthy plant and it hasn't done anything wrong, and I water it every Sunday, and it sits in the window seat and catches the light, and it has been quietly, in spite of everything, growing.